If Sigma INFJs starred in a horror movie, what if the most terrifying character in a horror film wasn't the monster, but the one person who could actually see it? If a Sigma INFJ walked onto a horror set, they wouldn't scream at the supernatural terror. They'd recognize it. They'd always have recognized it. They see the darkness behind the mirror, before the mirror even cracks. They'd been watching the thing in the corner of the room since the credits began rolling, noticing when others still believed the house was empty. The terror of a Sigma INFJ, in a horror narrative, isn't the external evil descending upon the innocent. It's something far more unsettling. It's the person who saw it coming, said nothing, and carried the weight of that knowing silently through the dark. In psychological horror, the villain is often the one who knows too much. But in a Sigma INFJ's arc, the true dread emerges from a different source entirely. It's not knowledge that terrifies. It's what happens when knowledge becomes a curse you cannot share. It's the price of clarity. It's the peculiar isolation of being right about the darkness when everyone else still wants to believe in the light. They are not the protagonist who discovers the truth and rallies the group. They are the ones standing at the periphery, having always known, watching the others stumble into the exact horrors they could have prevented. And they feel nothing, because feeling would be a luxury they learned to abandon long ago. Or perhaps they feel everything, in a silence so complete that no one can hear it. This is the Sigma INFJ in horror. Not hunted, but haunting. Not the victim, but the keeper of the house's dark memory. Not defeated by the evil, but irreversibly changed by the clarity it brings. They don't survive the film by defeating the monster. They survive by becoming something the monster cannot quite touch, precisely because they've already seen through its eyes and found them empty. The real terror is this: what happens when the person who sees everything refuses to look away? Imagine a Sigma INFJ character in a classic haunted house scenario, not as the naive newcomer who doesn't believe in ghosts, but as the one who moves into the house already knowing something is wrong. They knew before they arrived. They felt it in the postal code. They recognized the weight in the photographs online. Something about the way the light fell in those pictures told them an entire history of suffering that the estate agent had strategically cropped out. But they moved in anyway. Not the watcher who becomes obsessed with evidence, not the one who frantically gathers photographs and sound recordings to convince the skeptics. This is something else entirely. The Sigma INFJ recognizes the haunting with the same quality of knowing they bring to understanding human nature. The ghost isn't a mystery to solve, it's a presence to accept. They move through the house with the unsettling calm of someone who has already made peace with its occupants. They see the shadow in the hallway and nod, as if in recognition. Not fear, recognition. This is what makes them frightening to watch. Not frightened, but frightening. The others in the house, perhaps a well-meaning partner, perhaps friends drawn into the experience. They watch this person move through spaces where the temperature drops and the air thickens, and the Sigma INFJ remains untouched by panic. They make tea. They sit in the library where the coldest spot is located, and read as though they're anywhere else. When the lights flicker, they don't react. They've already accounted for it. They're not surprised by anything the house shows them, because they've already divined the house's logic, its patterns, its purposes. The others begin to wonder if the Sigma INFJ can even feel what's happening, or if something in their nature has rendered them immune to fear. What they don't understand is that the Sigma INFJ is more afraid than any of them. But their fear operates on a different frequency. They're not afraid of the ghost. They're afraid of what the ghost represents. The consequence of unspoken truths. The weight of isolation. The way suffering calcifies into something that doesn't need a body to haunt. There's a moment in the third act where the manifestations become violent. Objects move. The entity grows aggressive because it recognizes that this particular human sees it clearly, sees the shape of its pain, sees the reason for its rage, and refuses to indulge it with denial or hysteria. The Sigma INFJ has seen through the haunting to the humanity beneath it, and that clarity is precisely what enrages a spirit that has been fed only on fear and incomprehension for decades. When the entity finally confronts them directly, manifesting in that moment of maximum vulnerability, the Sigma INFJ looks at it without flinching. They see the face of someone who was never heard, who spent their isolation crying for help in a house that was too full of noise to listen. The Sigma INFJ has spent their entire life in that position. They recognize themselves in the ghost. And that's when something shifts. The haunting doesn't stop. The violence doesn't cease. But it changes. The entity fixates on the Sigma INFJ with an intensity that seems almost like kinship. Not friendship, not redemption, but recognition. The Sigma INFJ has become the only person in the house who understands what it means to be eternally alone in a space full of others. They become mirrors to each other across the veil. The others survive the night, eventually. But the Sigma INFJ doesn't leave the house. Long after the others have fled to hospitals, therapy, and the safety of daylight, the Sigma INFJ remains. Not possessed, and not trapped. But fundamentally transformed by the fact that they were the only ones who ever truly looked at what was suffering. They stay, because leaving feels like betrayal. They stay because someone must bear witness. They stay because in a horror narrative the most terrifying ending isn't death. It's the choice to remain. Not X but Y. The Sigma INFJ isn't haunted by the house. The house has been haunted by the very quality that defines the Sigma INFJ, the refusal to look away from suffering. Not afraid, but capable of a clarity that burns. Not isolated by choice, but by the price of seeing. They see the darkness not as an external threat, but as an extension of the psychological landscape they've always inhabited. The true horror is that they finally find something that matches their internal reality, and they cannot leave it, because to leave it would be to deny the only kinship they've ever felt. The unresolved paradox. The Sigma INFJ walks deeper into the darkness, not because they're drawn to evil, but because they've finally found something that doesn't ask them to pretend to be less aware than they are. The haunting didn't trap them, recognition did. There's a particular kind of psychological horror that emerges when a Sigma INFJ possesses information that could save others, but refuses to speak it. This isn't strategic silence born of manipulation. It's something more devastating. The silence of someone who has learned that their truth causes more harm than good, who has watched what happens when they speak, what they see, and who has decided that some truths are daggers, meant only for themselves. Imagine a Sigma INFJ who recognizes the danger before anyone else. They see the colleague who is becoming increasingly unstable, and recognize the patterns of someone who is fracturing. They see the friend whose relationship is a cage wearing human faces. They see the family member's secret that will destroy everything if exposed. They see the trajectory of events with the kind of clarity that comes from understanding the deep structure of human motivation, the way fear shapes behavior, the weight that certain truths carry when released into social systems unprepared for them. And they say nothing, not because they're cruel, not because they don't care. They refuse to speak because they understand something that the more conventionally empathetic INFJ has not yet learned. That knowledge is a burden, and to give someone knowledge is to give them a weight they may never be able to set down. The truth that arrives too early becomes trauma. The truth that arrives too late becomes tragedy. The truth that arrives at the right time is often the truth that destroys. The horror lies in the position itself. They know. They watch, they don't intervene. In a horror film, this transforms the Sigma INFJ into something neither villain nor hero, but something far more unsettling. The figure who could have prevented catastrophe through a single sentence, and chose not to speak it. Not from apathy, but from a darkness of their own making. A calculus of harm that they've run through their mind 1,000 times, and arrived at the conclusion that silence however agonizing, is the least destructive option. Watch what happens in the scenario. The Sigma INFJ sits across from the person making a choice they can already see the consequences of. The friend is about to confront the partner in a way that will either crack the relationship open or force them both into a denial so complete that it becomes psychological death. The family member is about to speak a secret that will rewrite everyone's understanding of their history. The colleague is making a professional decision that will likely lead to catastrophe. The Sigma INFJ knows, they see it, they could intervene, but as they open their mouth, they feel something far older than fear. They feel the weight of every time they've spoken truth and watched it splinter in someone's hands. They feel the memory of being the one who had to hold someone as they processed information that rewrote their reality. They feel the particular loneliness of being the only person who carries the burden of knowing. So they don't speak, they watch. They let the disaster unfold with the knowledge that they could have altered its course. The horror of their position isn't that they fail to help. It's that they are unable to do so. It's that they succeed in maintaining their silence. And the cost of that success is a specific kind of isolation that cannot be healed, because it cannot be explained to those who don't understand why speaking the truth is sometimes the greatest cruelty. After the catastrophe comes, the others reach out. They want the Sigma INFJ to confirm their suspicions, to validate their grief, to join them in processing what happened. But the Sigma INFJ can say nothing. To admit that they knew would be to reveal the violence of their silence. To pretend they didn't know would be a lie that would destroy the already fragile architecture of their relationships. They're trapped between two unbearable positions, and they choose a third. They remove themselves, not dramatically, not with an explanation. They simply begin a slow process of disappearance, becoming less available, less present, less involved. The psychological horror is that no one can pursue them into this withdrawal without the Sigma INFJ articulating the reason. And articulating the reason means speaking the truth they've already decided is too destructive to voice. So everyone assumes the Sigma INFJ is being distant, unreasonable, perhaps unkind. No one sees the geometry of the trap they've constructed for themselves through the act of compassionate silence. The scenario that illustrates this: late evening, the Sigma INFJ and their closest friend sit together. The friend is telling them about a decision they're making, and the Sigma INFJ can see, with complete certainty, that this decision is a step toward their friend's destruction. Not immediate, not obvious, but inevitable. The dominoes are already in motion. The friend will be hurt, will lose something irreplaceable, will become someone smaller and more afraid than they are in this moment. The Sigma INFJ hears all of this in the subtext. They see it playing out in the friend's face, in the nervous energy, in the way they're framing the narrative to justify what they've already decided. And in the space where they could speak, the Sigma INFJ instead asks a gentle question, not revealing, not directive. Just a question that invites the friend to examine their own logic. The friend misses the question entirely, and continues with their plan. And the Sigma INFJ doesn't push. They've already tried. They've already seen what happens when they push. So they sit with their knowledge, their foreknowledge, their certainty about the suffering that's about to arrive. They hold it alone. And when the suffering comes, when the friend calls in crisis needing comfort, the Sigma INFJ is there, but they cannot say, "I knew, I saw this coming. I chose not to warn you because I believed that your learning this lesson yourself would be less destructive than my intervention." Because articulating that would transform the Sigma INFJ from comfort into the very horror the friend is already experiencing. The knowledge that something could have been prevented. Not X but Y. The Sigma INFJ isn't cruel for their silence. They're merciful. But mercy that costs the merciful their own peace of mind is its own form of horror. Not refusing to care, but caring so much that they've learned to weaponize their compassion against themselves. Not unkind, but aware that kindness sometimes requires the violence of holding back. The true terror is that their silence is an act of love, and no one can ever know it. The unresolved paradox. They possess the very knowledge that would heal the others, and their refusal to speak it is both the highest form of respect for human autonomy and the deepest form of abandonment. The horror is that both things are true simultaneously, and no amount of explanation could ever resolve that tension. There exists a particular category of psychological horror that emerges not from external threat but from internal capacity. A Sigma INFJ possesses a quality that, if fully activated, would give them a kind of power over the social and psychological landscape that surrounds them. They understand manipulation at such a granular level that they could weaponize it. They see through deception so completely that they could exploit it. They recognize vulnerability in others with such precision that they could destroy with a single, carefully chosen word, spoken at exactly the right moment. They don't do these things, but everyone around them knows they could. The horror of their restraint is that it exists in a constant state of tension. The Sigma INFJ is not redeemed by their refusal to use their power. The constant internal negotiation with it defines them. They feel the weight of what they could do, and they live with the awareness that only their own internal architecture prevents them from becoming something devastating. In a horror narrative, this becomes the central psychological premise. The Sigma INFJ is the character with the most dangerous capability, and the entire tension of the film revolves around whether that capability will remain restrained, or whether the circumstances will arise that finally justify its activation. Consider the scenario. A Sigma INFJ is positioned within a social group, where there exists a person or a power structure that is actively causing harm. It could be a charismatic narcissist who has attached themselves to the group like a parasite, feeding on attention and validation. It could be an institutional authority that is perpetuating injustice. It could be an intimate relationship where one person is slowly erasing another through psychological manipulation. The Sigma INFJ sees it. They always see it. And they understand with complete clarity what needs to happen to stop it. They could speak the truth. A specific truth. One that would shatter the narcissist's carefully constructed image, would expose the authority's corruption, and would awaken the person being erased to the reality of their own diminishment. The knowledge of what they could say sits in them like poison. They don't speak it, not because they're afraid, but because they understand something that most people never learn. That wielding power, even for good purposes, transforms the wielder. To use their capability to destroy someone else's illusions is to step into a role they will never be able to step out of. To become the truth teller is to become the threat. To become the one who can dismantle deceptions is to become, in some people's minds, the one who orchestrated them. The restraint costs them. It costs them profoundly. They watch suffering continue because they've chosen not to intervene with their particular form of power. They feel the weight of that choice in every conversation, where they bite back the insight that could change everything. They become increasingly isolated, not because they're withdrawn but because they're constantly engaged in an internal negotiation with their own capability. The horror deepens when someone else in the group discovers what the Sigma INFJ is capable of. Maybe it's accidental. Maybe the Sigma INFJ allows a glimpse of their perception to slip through in a moment of exhaustion. The other person suddenly sees the whole architecture of the Sigma INFJ's understanding. They see that the Sigma INFJ has known all along. They see that the Sigma INFJ could have changed everything and chose not to. And instead of feeling grateful for the restraint, most people feel afraid. They wonder what the Sigma INFJ is choosing to see in them. They wonder if the Sigma INFJ is withholding judgment, or storing it for future use. The knowledge that they're being truly perceived by someone who has the capability to weaponize that perception transforms the dynamic entirely. Trust becomes ambiguous. Kindness becomes suspect. The Sigma INFJ's refusal to use their power becomes, paradoxically, more terrifying than if they had simply wielded it without restraint. Because restraint implies choice, and choice suggests that at any moment, the restraint could end. Imagine the specific moment of psychological horror. The Sigma INFJ, and the person who has discovered their capability, are alone. The other person has been harmed by the situation that the Sigma INFJ could have prevented through a single intervention. The person is in pain, and they're looking at the Sigma INFJ with an expression that combines need and dread. Part of them wants the Sigma INFJ to speak the truth finally. Part of them is terrified of what it would mean if the Sigma INFJ did. The Sigma INFJ meets their gaze and says nothing. Not a refusal, not a judgment. Just the absolute certainty that they're aware of everything, that they could change everything, and that they've chosen what they will and will not do. The other person will never know if that choice was merciful or cruel. They'll never know if the Sigma INFJ's silence protected them, or abandoned them. And the Sigma INFJ will live with that ambiguity, that irresolvable tension forever. The darkness of this horror is that the Sigma INFJ is never the villain, but they're also never entirely the hero. They're the character who contains the potential for destruction and has chosen to internalize it rather than externalize it. The power hasn't gone away. It's simply been turned inward, becoming a slow burn rather than an explosion. The Sigma INFJ becomes dangerous not through action, but through the weight of what they've chosen not to do. Not X but Y. The Sigma INFJ isn't kind for refusing to use their power. They're protecting themselves from the consequences of power. Not passive, but profoundly strategic in their restraint. Not unaware, but so aware that the only way to maintain their integrity is to refuse the very intervention that could redeem them in others' eyes. The horror is that their restraint is simultaneously the most noble and the most self-protective thing they do. Both truths exist. The unresolved paradox. They could save everyone but won't. Not because they're weak but because they understand that salvation granted through their intervention would be indistinguishable from domination. They refuse to wield power not because they're incapable of bearing its weight but because they see the shape of what they would become if they did. The terror lies in the fact that no one can ever know if their restraint was mercy, or the most refined form of cruelty, refusing to save someone precisely so you never have to bear responsibility for their salvation. And the Sigma INFJ will carry that ambiguity alone, in a silence so complete that it becomes its own form of haunting. What remains after the horror film ends is not resolution. It's a question that sits in the space where the credits roll. If the most terrifying character is the one who sees everything, refuses to intervene, and carries the weight of that refusal in absolute solitude, then who is the real monster? The Sigma INFJ haunts not because they're evil, but because they're too aware to be redeemed by conventional morality. They exist in a space that transcends good and evil, occupying instead the darker territories, where understanding and isolation become indistinguishable. In a horror film, that's the story that lingers. Not the jump scares or the violence, but the image of a character who has looked into the abyss of human nature, their own and everyone else's, and decided that some knowledge is too dangerous to speak, some power too corrupting to wield, and some darkness too intimate to ever fully share. They survive the horror not by defeating it, but by becoming so intimate with it, that the distinction between observer and observed begins to dissolve. The camera pulls back. The Sigma INFJ sits alone in the dark. And they're not afraid. They never were. They were only ever the one who understands that sometimes the greatest horror isn't the external darkness. It's the clarity that comes when you finally stop pretending you can't see. If you've felt the weight of seeing things others refuse to see. If you've held truths that felt too dangerous to speak. If you've recognized your own capacity for devastation and chosen restraint instead. This is your narrative. Not redemption. Not damnation. but the narrow path between them, where most heroes and villains would lose their minds. Comment below with your own experience of walking that path. What truths have you held? What power have you refused? What does it cost you to see so clearly? We're building a community of those who understand that sometimes the deepest horror isn't surviving what's outside us. It's surviving what we know about ourselves. Subscribe to explore more of these liminal territories where psychology, mythology, and darkness converge. The conversation continues in the comments, and it's only just beginning.